Welcome to Wisdom for Life, where we sift through philosophy to find practical advice that you can use in your everyday life. Hi, I'm Dan Hayes. I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Greg Sadler, and today we're talking about
Stoicism, concern, and caring, and we're going to try to dispel some myths and some misconceptions about Stoic philosophy and practice, which has been getting more and more popular over the last decade or so, actually going back even further than that. And Dan and I are both members of the Milwaukee Stoic Fellowship. We're both co-organizers of that group, which is one of many local Stoic groups worldwide. And you've heard us talk, if you've listened to this radio show before, about Stoicism quite a bit. It's one of the main approaches that we draw upon, both of us in our practice and thinking things through. So when we talk about applying philosophy to life, that's one of the main ones that we do. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan and let you sort of sort through some of the misconceptions about what it means to be a Stoic that you've seen and you've run into by people who are kind of getting it right and kind of getting it wrong. What would you say is well, I mean, we could actually run through a whole bunch of them, but maybe we won't do that today. What would you say is one of the biggest ones?
I guess the first thing is the idea that Stoicism is just like a group of life acts and not like a whole system. And people will grab certain things from that. There's lots of like really interesting nuggets that are part of the system that are sometimes a little bit counterintuitive, but people will grab onto them and they might misconceive that this is the whole of what Stoicism is. And one of the big ones that is rather misconstrued is like, the dichotomy of control kind of being like the be all end all. And that's,
We're gonna talk about that in just a few minutes. The dichotomy of control is this notion that you just stick to what you actually have control over after you've managed to identify it and forget about everything else. And not really what the Stoic does, right?
Right.
So what about people who use Stoicism, or they conceive of it this way, as a reason to withdraw from other people, to isolate themselves, to try to insulate themselves from the rest of the world? I mean, is that based in anything, or is that like totally? It's
actually,
go ahead.
It's totally, I'd say, counter to one of the major projects that Stoicism is trying to solve, is how do you have a good life while interacting with the other people in the world? That the Stoic is someone that is in the world, that is interacting daily, and is not, cloistering themselves or removing themselves from society. They're one of the major schools that they had rather opposing views to were the Epicureans, who would, they have this whole idea of the garden and returning to the garden and kind of walling yourself off from all the people that we have to deal with in day to day, because they're a cause of being upset, and they're like, okay, let's just like remove all the things. But the whole point of Stoicism is how do you maintain that calmness, that tranquility, that equanimity, and still actually be there for the other people and with the other people.
Yeah, that's actually a great point. And the Epicureans, we're missing some texts, actually almost all texts from them from classical antiquity, but it does look like they actually did have a garden, and the whole point of it was to withdraw from society into this, we could almost like call it an ideal intentional community. Obviously, they must have had problems and conflicts in there and had to work them out. But what they ended up doing is taking themselves out of, the ancients called it the political sphere, but we would call it the social sphere. And you're right. The Stoics say, no, that's not the way to go. That's actually counterproductive. So before we jump in and talk about, well, what is Stoicism and, some of the key features of it, why do you think today there are so many people? I mean, you see this in Stoic Facebook groups or other places. People say, oh, but I thought Stoicism was about withdrawing myself from anything that could potentially bother me. Where's that disconnect coming from, do you think?
Well, as we touched on a little bit earlier, the dichotomy of control is one of the first things that is kind of usually presented to people. And a lot of people, when they first enter into it, that's like they don't know that this is a piece that has to be supported by other things like action and your acceptance of things. And without the rest of the pieces here, this one thing can't stand alone.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So we'll definitely be hitting on that in a bit. We should talk about what Stoicism is, just in case anybody's confused and they're like, "Hey, I know about somebody being Stoic. It means that stiff upper lip thing." We have something a bit different in mind. Well, now why do you say that? Tisk.
I don't know. Partly I kind of associated with the British, and you said the stiff upper lip, and so that's where it kind of came from. But absolutely, this there's a common colloquial usage, and we usually call this like little s Stoicism, which is the common usage of the term nowadays, and then there's big S Stoicism, which is the actual philosophy of life. And I think we should go in like, what is a philosophy of life? And that is a whole set of mores and values in which you can live a good life. Like that's the whole idea of the Stoic project, as well as many of the other philosophical projects at the time, were like, how does one live a good life?
Yeah.
And the whole idea within Stoicism is there's a number of things that we'll get into, in which the argument is, if you follow these things, you're going to have a more calm, equanimous, and peaceful life.
Yeah, and I think there's other things that will come out of that necessarily, but the Stoics were willing to say, well, if you don't get that's okay, like being more productive in the workplace, so if you can calm your mind and not get into unnecessary conflicts with your boss, with your customers, with suppliers, with your coworkers, and whoever else happens to show up, the UPS person, delivering a package, you'll certainly go further, right? You're going to get more done. But the goal is not simply to be a better productive drone in getting things done. It's to, change who you are as a person so that you hold on to the things that are genuinely good, and you slowly strip away the things that, although you might be a little, attached to them at first, turn out to be counterproductive for you. They turn out to be bad. And you're right. All the ancient philosophies that were philosophies of life were doing that. The Epicureans had their own shtick. The Cynics, the Platonists and Aristotelians, even the skeptics were about doing something with yourself. And they all had, like you said, different values that they were arranging, different texts, different arguments, different cognitive approaches, a lot of overlap between those, different ways of looking at the emotions, different practices that you would engage in. And they often would borrow from each other. Seneca, great example that we've talked about here on the air, a Stoic philosopher who, when he's talking with an Epicurean friend of his, Lucilius, he has no problem quoting Epicurus, saying, well, we can go into the enemy camp and take their stuff. I don't remember exactly, to take their fire, take their tools, whatever it is that they're getting from them, right? So if you had to summarize Stoicism, we've talked a little bit about a few things, and you've hit on some key points already. What else can we say about that Stoicism that gives people an idea what's distinctive to it?
So another thing is that's kind of also directly counters this idea of like, not caring, is that Stoicism teaches that we are part of greater wholes. That we are not a
well, there's that no
rock.
man is an island, right?
Yes, thank you. Or like a single solitary rock, just facing the waves. It's that we, as social creatures, live in communities, that we depend on each other for certain things, as well as we, because of these relationships, we have certain duties to other people around us, and in fact that we have a duty to all people, not just those people who are closest to us.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They often use metaphors of what we would call social animals, like bees, for example. Marcus says what is good for the hive is good for the bee. And, if you're a drone who's mated with the queen and then been pushed out, left to die for winter, you might say, I don't know about that. But, these metaphors can be extended only so far. But the idea, I think it is quite correct. No, we often say nobody is truly self-made. Anytime that we find somebody who's particularly successful, there's all sorts of other people in their background and factors that came together in the right place at the right time to allow the person to make their contribution. But their contribution is relying on an entire fabric of others. And recognizing that would be part of something else that I think we should talk about in terms of Stoicism. It would be part of two particular virtues. Justice, recognizing other people's parts that they've done is only fair. And then wisdom, using our minds correctly. And Stoicism, it's not the only philosophy that talks about virtue, but they say that virtue, it's not just that virtue is its own reward. It's that virtue is what's going to lead us to happiness, but virtue also is happiness or contentment or however else we want to put that end state. So we should always prioritize living a life of the virtues. And if we realize we don't have them, well, then we got to work on that, right? So that's a big part of it as well. What else do you think we need to say about for listeners who don't know much about Stoicism? Anything else come to mind?
Well, the main thing that comes to mind is kind of like, why are we touch on Stoicism from time to time. But the reason that we're actually going a little bit deeper into this today is that because we are starting a season of Stoicism.
That's right. So September through November for the international Stoic community. You might say, wait, what international Stoic community? Nobody ever told me about this. Well, it's been building for the last 20 years, largely because of the internet, but there's like all sorts of books and literature out there. There are local Stoic meeting groups. There's all sorts of cool online ways to engage people, groups, pages, and we also, and when I say we, I'm talking about the Modern Stoicism organization, which you might also say, wait, what's that? They sponsor a annual Stoicon every year. And it used to be held in, pretty major metropolitan places like London or New York or Toronto. It was held one year in Athens, because they wanted to celebrate philosophy in Greece. But last year it went online because of COVID, and it's being held online as well this year, and we'll probably keep doing that in the future. And everybody's invited. We've made it as affordable as possible by letting people just make donations to it, and so it's a cool event. There's lots of speakers. All sorts of local groups will be having their own Stoicon X's. It's sort of like TED and TEDx. So there's going to be all sorts of Stoicon X events happening through September all the way to November. There's an International Stoic Week that there's like a 7-day course that people can participate in. I think this will be the 10th year because it started in 2012. So that makes it, they've successfully done, if we pull it off this year, 10 years, right?
Right. And that's something that I would highly recommend if anyone's like even tangentially interested in the topic, it's like, hey, just take a week. It doesn't take much. There's like a little morning thing and a little afternoon thing, but just a little dip your toes into what it is to have a philosophy of life. The data that they've gathered over the years has shown that for a large proportion of the people that go through this, they have an increase in their daily happiness, or what they call zest, which is a number of different factors all put together.
Yeah, and resilience too. Being able to deal with the stuff that life throws at you. We won't say anything stronger than stuff, but you can come up with all sorts of other words on your own that are a little bit more vociferous and negative about that. I mean, practicing Stoic philosophy will help with that. And Dan's right. There's data now to back that up, which is kind of cool.
Yeah,
that's actually something we should. While we're on the data thing, there is something else that's kind of interesting. There's other studies out there where they looked at, you mentioned the lowercase s stoicism, the stiff upper lip, stuffing your emotions down, all of that sort of stuff. That actually leads to negative outcomes. That makes people less resilient. Practicing actual Stoic philosophy, what we're going to be talking about in just a bit, that leads to better outcomes. And so not only do we know that, there's one good path to take, we also know that the thing that's not really Stoicism, but people use the word for it, is bad for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So,
well, let's talk about the dichotomy of control, because I know we mentioned it a little bit earlier. Do you want to give a little spiel about that, about what it means, or?
Yes. So the dichotomy of control is there are things that are in our control, and there are things that are not in our control. And sometimes people kind of okay, well, I have influence over this thing or whatnot. And the Stoics really make a pretty hard line that there is a distinction between those things that are completely within our control and those things that even have a small modicum of outside influence, and those things are the things that are not in our control. And so the things that are in our control are our things that we like, the things that we are drawn towards, the things that we are averse to, the things that we push away, and our actions towards doing something. So, for example, I could be handcuffed, and I could want to raise my hands over my head, but I would be disallowed physically from doing that. But I have this volition to raise my hands over my head. But of those things, so this is kind of like a small list of things that are totally within your control.
Yeah.
And the things that are not in your control are things like wealth, health, reputation. You cannot will yourself not to be sick, or you can't will yourself to not die. Eventually, these things are going to come for you. There are many things that you can do to make it so that you have a better chance of living longer as well as being healthy, but to just say, I will not, get sick ever, or I will not die, is not going to do much for you.
Yeah, that's true. Same thing with money, right? You can save your money, you can be prudent in what you spend it on, but inflation can erode it away, or somebody could steal it. And this we could go on and on. We could do an entire episode about wealth, I think. I do want to point out that Stoics also say that another set of things that we have control over are what they call assents, and that's a technical term. You could call it what we agree with or buy into, what we co-sign mentally. So if I see, and this can happen both in terms of things that present themselves to me immediately and I buy into it, and also with my reasoning processes or my feelings, whether they're really reasonable or not. So if somebody's mean to me and I judge them to have said something derogatory, maybe they actually didn't, but I judge it to be so, then I'm going to be negatively affected by that. And I'm going to get maybe hurt or angry or some other emotion, maybe anxious about it. And the Stoics would say you're responsible for those emotional responses because you could choose to see things differently. And I think this is very liberating because many people believe that our thoughts, our emotions, our opinions, they're just given to us, or like our body, does them, and we have no control over them at all. Earlier you mentioned desires and aversions. I just like what I like. And you can ask yourself, well, why do you like that? You can explore it. It's not an automatic given. I mean, some things seem to be like pretty automatic. When we're kids, we like candy, but I remember taking my daughter to a birthday party, and they had a cake, and it was a chocolate cake. And one of the parents said, "Oh, my kid doesn't like chocolate." And I was like, "Who doesn't like chocolate?" Well, somebody doesn't. And so, it's not automatic to the human race that you must like and desire chocolate. I mean, it's pretty compelling, but it's controllable. Right? So, yeah, and we should explore a little bit more of this, like having influence. So if you don't completely control something.
Actually,
go ahead.
Could I would love to jump into that, but I want to kind of delve into that.
The chocolate one, or?
Just the idea of that we are responsible, or like we have control over these things, and I would extend this into the, we are wanting to think about this as a process, okay. And so like, I might go into Stoicism, and like an easy example is like, people cut you off in traffic and that you get an automatic response.
Yeah.
So this twinge of anger comes up and hits you.
Yeah.
And through time you can kind of, reprogram or retrain yourself away from these judgments. And so it's not like, oh, I'm going to take up Stoicism and all of a sudden all these things that they say are outside, or like that are passing things that are within my control, that are like causing me anger. It's not going to like immediately happen.
Yeah, yeah.
And that these things, you'll still have these emotions arise. And the Stoics do break down the emotion to 3 different parts: the impression, the immediate thing that comes to mind, the place in which you can actually sit there and examine that, and either assenting or dissenting to that emotion. So like, this is really simple. Like, you tell your kids, like, you get angry, count to 10.
Right.
And so it gives you that space to just go, why am I angry? And think about that. And it's like, because I had some judgment about that thing, and that person thinks that was bad. And the Stoics would say, like, these things are usually not bad. And the real bad thing is the way that you're going to be reacting to these things.
Yeah. That's a good point. It helps you to, and you're right. It doesn't, it's not like flipping a switch where, well, I read a Stoic book and now everything falls into place, right? I think even on a cognitive level, there's some things that when you're reading the Stoics, unless you're actually practicing for a while, some of those things don't really make sense completely,
right?
Like with any intentional way of living. But yeah, it does provide a bit of possibility for liberation. I wanted to go back though to the things that we don't completely control. Maybe something else is running the show, like just physical processes, or what the Stoics would call fate. But a lot of times it's other people who don't have complete control over that thing, but they do have some power over it. So if I really want to be recognized by everybody as an important person, if we, so we're going to use some Milwaukee metaphors here, right? We have a guy called the Milverine.
Oh, yes.
And you've met him, right? I think at one point or another? Or
I'm not.
Okay. But you've seen him. I haven't actually seen him. And he looks like Wolverine, the comic book character, but he's from Milwaukee, and he moves around and does things, and,
mostly he's known for walking everywhere that he goes, and he never wears a shirt.
That's right. Yeah, because he's very hairy, right?
Yes.
So if I decide, actually, that furnishes a really great example. If I decide as a non-hairy chest guy, who's also not as built as that guy either, and probably doesn't have the hair to pull it off, and I don't think I could get my beard to be as bushy as his, that I want to replace him and become the new, whatever we're going to call, maybe I'm the Milwaukee Sabretooth or something.
I thought you'd be the Milwaukee dude, but okay.
Okay, well, there you go. Yeah, I mean, maybe I should, like, as they say, stay in your lane, right?
Yes.
So we'll shift to that. I decide that I want to be like the character, the dude, which some people say that I look like, and so I put on the what would we call it? The dialect that he has. Oh, I have the sweater, right?
Yes.
And I could easily get the kind of stuff. I would just wear a dirty T-shirt and shorts and flip flops and walk around, right? And I start saying, like, "That's your opinion, man," and things like that. There's no guarantee that I'm going to be able to pull it off, even if I'm really trying, because other people can say, "No, I don't think he's the dude at all." You know, it's not a very good impression. It's actually, this is another kind of funny thing. I think we might have talked about this on air. There are celebrities who, they go into like a crowd of people who are impersonating them, and people say, "You're not a very good impersonator of this person or that person or this person. Get out of here." You know, and now what this points out is so much of social life is pretty arbitrary. And if we allow ourselves to get too drawn into it and make the measure of our happiness or success that we pull these things off, it's just not going to happen. It's like, you know, Epictetus talks about this musician who can play his instrument really well, but he doesn't control what the crowd does. And if he takes the crowd's applause as an index for him being a good musician, he's going to be filled with anxiety because you just can't control that, you know? Mm-hmm. And you might say, well, I can do things and those should make things happen. Yeah, go ahead and try that, because, you know, the Stoics will say you'll find out real quick just how little control you have over those matters. Now, this leads us to another point. If you don't have any control over those matters, shouldn't you just like withdraw completely from them and say, I'm not going to play that cricket game. I'm going to take my pieces and go home, or pick up my ball and walk away?
So this whole reminds me of, like, you know, you can, like, you're an aficionado of metal, but some people really don't like metal.
That's right.
And so if you go to the Philharmonic and you put on a metal show, the audience there's you might be the best metal band in the world, and you are still going to get potentially booed. So you find your audience, and if you need, like, this is the audience, the only audience, and like either you define like what you want to make, and if like metal is the thing that you got to make, then you make that metal, kind of regardless of that outcome. But if you're like, you know, your goal is to have the adoration of the crowd, you might do things that would lead you to have a better chance, but that there's always that chance, and it's not going to be in your control.
That's a really great example that I think we can draw some other analogies to, and it's not just the applause or adoration of the crowd per se, it's this crowd, right? Mm-hmm. So if you want people who are more likely to appreciate what you're doing, go play at Shank Hall, you know, where metal bands play, local metal bands. That would make a lot more sense than trying to go to the Milwaukee Symphony and walk out on stage and start shredding, right? Unless they've invited you to do that. And you know, we could say this with so many things. You know, when somebody has a bad breakup, we often say things like, "Oh, you know, there's many other fish in the sea." And that's right. You know, there's nothing that says that your affection and capacity to love has to be met by this particular person. And if you can like withdraw from where things clearly aren't lining up, that enables you to start looking elsewhere. And we could say this about job stuff. I mean, maybe some people aren't suited for certain jobs and they make themselves miserable by insisting on pushing that. We have that expression, the what is it, square peg in the round hole, or is it the round peg in the square hole? I mean, either one doesn't work, right?
Right.
Yeah. And a lot of jobs, I think, are sort of like that. I actually see that sometimes with people who have the wrong major in college, and they're like, well, it's junior year and I've already got these credits in, and they're miserable. And you're like, do you want to go and become this? And they're like, not really, but I'm there. And I think the following...
That's the sunk cost fallacy.
Well, you need to explain that a little bit.
So sunk cost fallacy is the fact that we often throw good money after bad, and whenever we either make an investment in either money or time or any other particular external good, we can say well, I've already done. I'm I'm in for a penny, in for a pound type thing. But if you were to stop and say, okay, I'm starting from point zero. Does it make any point more sense to continue down, to put money into this investment, either time or whatever? And if the answer is no, then it doesn't matter what you've spent already. Any extra money that you're putting in there is just, good money after bad.
It's interesting because we're going to talk about emotions soon. And I think that, there you can bring up a couple different emotions. One reason why people stick with sunk costs, particularly if there's conflict involved with it, and we're seeing this in terms of people's politics right now, is shame. They would much rather stick to a false narrative about how things happened and who's to blame than admit that they were wrong, because admitting that they're wrong, especially after they've been in conflict with other people, means feeling embarrassment or shame. And that fear can keep people glued there. Epictetus also says something really interesting in one of his discourses. Epictetus, the great Stoic philosopher, he's talking about a guy who has decided to do something. And I don't remember exactly what stupid thing he decided to do, but he's saying, I'm being a Stoic because I'm being resolute. I'm sticking with the thing and nobody's going to influence me. And Epictetus says, hold on, buddy, we got to back up one step. Is the thing that you decided to do reasonable? If it's not reasonable and you're just sticking to it, that's not Stoicism, that's stubbornness. That's obstinacy. Right? And I think, sometimes people get there, they get that emotional comportment where nobody is going to move them. And that's not really Stoicism, because to be Stoic means to live in accordance with our nature, and that is a rational nature. And that's a good segue into the next thing we were going to talk about, which is it's not just a rational nature, it's a social nature, right?
Right. So we're social creatures with a capacity for reason. Kind of depends on how much we actually use that capacity or how much we build it, but we do have that capacity.
That's true. I think a lot of people, when they hear that we're rational creatures, they assume that rationality is like an all or nothing thing too. And it's definitely not. I mean, we're born with a great potential for developing as rational creatures, but I don't know if any of us ever fully develop and deploy that. I mean, I do dumb stuff myself, and I should be pretty well along since I've been studying philosophy and teaching it for a long time. Presumably, if philosophy helps you out to be more rational, then at 51 years old, I should be, pretty rational. But, we all have these pockets. And then the question is, well, do we hide them away, or do we try to work on that? Do we recognize where we need to do more? And I don't think that I've never met anybody who I would consider totally, completely rational all the time. Have you?
No. And this is why I think a lot of economic theory is pretty funny, because they kind of base
they make
it
that
off
assumption.
of this. Yeah, all humans are perfectly rational. They're always going to get the best, the most things for them. But there's so many things that are out there that will that we make decisions about that are not in our best financial interest.
Yeah, and we often, I think this is another thing we could explore at great length. There's a difference between reasoning and rationalization. Rationalization is what people do after they've made a decision, and they're trying to look for some plausible reasoning process for it. And
right.
Some people will go for anything. Reasoning means that you actually try to seek out the truth, and you're probably willing to change your mind to some degree if factors change or somebody brings up a good point. And this goes back to the social nature thing. How do you figure out when you've got things wrong? Sometimes you can figure it out by, you put your finger in the mousetrap and you realize pretty quickly that by the pain inflicted on you that was a dumb decision. But there's so many things where we really need other people to come along and say, you're screwing up, man. Take a look at this, and maybe that's part of our social nature as well. The correctability, you might say, of human nature.
Yeah, there's so many other things, and it comes down to this idea that we are social creatures.
Yeah.
That a lot of times we will make bad logical deductions and reasoning or rationalization in order to make sure that we maintain our reputation within that social group. And so this is one of the things that Stoicism tries to put forth, is that our reputation is not a good in and of itself, and that we should try to remove that from the basis of our reasoning in choosing the good, virtuous decision and the action that follows.
We can say that about pretty much all of the things that the Stoics consider to be, and we're going to use a technical term here, indifference. Not meaning that they don't have any value at all, but they should be valued less than the genuine good, which is, moral goodness, virtue, which includes wisdom. I think you could say that about wealth. A lot of people make bad decisions on the basis, which they rationalize on the basis of, trying to protect their income or their property. We can say this about pleasure. Pleasure is something, or the prospect of pleasure can easily lead us into making bad decisions. Power, authority, positions, those sorts of things. People will often really stick their necks out in ways they won't for wealth to get a little power over somebody else. So yeah, that's quite true.
So the Stoics are here to try to find us a place where we can, live in accordance with both of these natures, that we're wanting to be part of this group, and how do we interact with people in a just way, the way that they ought to be treated, as well as not sacrificing those things that are actually the goods. They are moral actions here. And these things usually sometimes, people, because they have different ideas of what we call these indifference as actual goods, these things come into conflict. And the Stoics are saying, there's two levels of things, and the virtues are up here, and everything else is down here. It doesn't mean, as you said, it doesn't mean that they don't have value, but none of these things can really be traded for those things up here, these virtues.
Yeah, so to take an example, it's better to have some financial resources than to be impoverished. And the Stoics wouldn't say don't manage your money wisely. You actually should do that. But no amount of wealth that you accumulate and no amount of good decisions with your wealth is going to make you into a good person. You can be a vicious person in many other respects and be filthy rich. Money doesn't make the morality, you could say. And we could say the same thing about power, or having a nice body. If you have a body, as we all do, if you don't, you're dead. I don't know how you'd be listening to this if you don't have a body. You should take care of it. You shouldn't abuse it. You should probably wash it every so often, give it some exercise, put the right kind of things into it, try to minimize putting bad things into it. But that's not going to make you into a good person. You go to the gym, there's plenty of jerks at the gym. You can tell they're the ones who pick up the cleaner bottle and they take it with them because they're selfish, right? they're the ones that don't clean off the exercise equipment when they're done with it because they're lazy, or pick whatever else you want, right?
Right.
They might have very nice looking bodies, but that doesn't make them great. So that's a great thing to focus on. How does that pertain then to this mistaken idea of the Stoic as withdrawing themselves from other people?
So I wanted to say, if you don't believe that we are like social creatures, the idea of solitary confinement is considered in many parts of the world to be torture, because removing ourselves without our will away from other people's is highly detrimental to our mental well-being. And part of this is because, to be ostracized gives us a similar feeling to the dread of death, as, we as humans, as tribal peoples, before we really started sitting down and doing agriculture and whatnot, being removed from the group was basically equivalent to death. It was very hard for you to survive without the group. And that is really built into our core psychology here.
Yeah, and it's still used by some groups as a mode of punishment: shunning, banishing, disfellowing. You can really do a number on a person, especially if they're heavily invested in that particular group and they don't know how to make those sort of connections elsewhere. I mean, in another respect, when people are forced out of their workplace, they're made redundant, they're laid off. That's often quite psychologically devastating to people, because that would be part of their little clan or tribe or whatever they're part of, right?
Right. And because we define ourselves a lot of times by the groups that we are part of, and we realize our own human nature in the interactions and the camaraderie that we have with the groups. And so this kind of reminds me of, so there's this idea of Dunbar's number, which is at about 150. It's the number of people that a group can maintain with fairly close connections before it either disintegrates or splits.
Okay.
And so it's really hard to have more than 150 close friends. And we're not talking Facebook friends.
Yeah, some people have the full complement of 5,000 on Facebook, right?
Right. But we as humans have this special ability that we've developed as a psychological tool of creating categories for us to belong to, which supersedes these Dunbar numbers. And so instead of sticking with a tribe of up to 150 people, we decided we can all call ourselves a citizen of this state, or we can all call ourselves a member of this religion, or we can all call whatever group. And even though we don't know that per group or that those people specifically, we can say fandoms. I'm in North Carolina, and if I see someone with a Packer hat on, I'm going to go up and talk to him. Actually, I saw a guy with a Bucks shirt at a Trader Joe's the other day, and I struck up a conversation with him because, you know what? We had something in common. We were part of this group, even though, I've never met him.
It's funny because I don't know what the Bucks equivalent of this, but Packer Nation, right? Mm-hmm. And it exists spread out throughout the entire, it exists in other places, but the entire United States. Any major city, you can go on game day and find a bar where the Packers game will be playing. Mm-hmm. And when you walk in, this is actually something that my wife, Andy, observed in New York City, where people are, kind of they might put on airs about talking like a Midwesterner. And so they come in off the street, and it's a place called Kettle of Fish. And at first they're kind of relating to each other as New Yorkers that are of a certain, type and sort. And then after a while, all the yacht or hay language comes out, and everybody,
well, don't you know?
Exactly. Because they gel that way. So that's a good example. As a matter of fact, that's a good segue too to talk about emotions, because people often get quite emotional about sport. And, a lot of people have this mistaken notion about Stoicism that it means like turning off the emotions, almost like if you're turning off a water flow, or just stuffing them down, or, trying to ignore them as much as possible. And that's clearly not what classic Stoics taught or thought, right?
Right. And we've already touched about this a little bit in the breaking up of the emotion. But yeah, like the Stoics were reportedly, like the ancient ones, rather jovial individuals.
Yeah. Friendly, you could say, right? They had fun.
Right.
It was Chrysippus who's supposed to have died laughing at a funny sight. I mean, he was an old guy, so it was something about a donkey, and I don't quite remember exactly what happened, but, they didn't have a lack of a sense of humor, and they loved other people. Right?
And so it's the exact opposite here. Like, the Stoics are not about stuffing down these emotions, but to more fully understand them, to be so close to them that you are not taken away by them, that you know them intimately, and why you have these emotions arising in the first place.
Yeah, so a good example of this is one that they didn't have any positive role for as such, but we all run into sooner or later: loss or grief, right? I mean, this is kind of morbid to say this, but everybody that they're either going to die before you, or you're going to die before them, or you're going to die at the same time. So sooner or later, like, you and I are friends. If we're friends long enough, one of us will go to the other's funeral. And, presumably you miss people and all that. And the Stoics would say, well, it's not human to not miss people or to not feel sad. But that doesn't mean you have to, as people did in ancient times, like tear your beard out or wear black for a year or rip your clothes or sometimes people these days, like they jump on the coffin as it's going down into the grave. That's not serving anybody anything. And it's not a sign that you actually love them. Maybe the sign would be, like Seneca says, you go out and find new friends to replace the ones that you've lost. Wouldn't your friend want that for you? The Stoics also thought there were positive emotions, and among those they included love, affection, concern for others, care. These are not things that we should be avoiding, but we should be avoiding doing them in the wrong way. So,
right.
If you think about concern for somebody, there's being concerned where you take prudent steps to help them out, and then there's the being a worrywart where you're getting more out of the appearance of being concerned or occupying yourself with needless worries. And the Stoics say, well, that's counterproductive. Get rid of that.
Right.
So making those distinctions between positive and less productive emotional states, I think, would be an important part of Stoicism.
And once again, these are things that one works on. These aren't just a flip the switch type things.
Yeah. And yeah, you're right. Some of them you don't get the opportunity to work on them every day unless you do some exercises.
Right.
So grief, I mean, hopefully you don't have somebody dying every single day in your life, right?
Right.
But if you've had a recent loss, you can think about how you're dealing with it each day, I suppose. What are some other examples of emotions that you can work on bit by bit by bit?
Let's see. Hopefully greed and kind of ruminating on what is it actually a good? If you have this avarice towards these things and trying to reorient yourself towards the things that are actually good.
Okay.
I was thinking about just the losing people, and you can, like, there's the negative visualization, which we've spoken about in the past, talking about how we can, like, think about, okay, I'm going to think about, like, I know that eventually one of my loved ones is going to die, and maybe I can stem this a little bit by thinking about how I would react to it and try to kind of experience a small portion of that in order to kind of inoculate you against the rush, the tidal wave that kind of hits us when, people pass away, especially if it's sudden.
That's a great example of something, going back to the beginning of our conversation, where the Stoics differed from the Epicureans. The Epicureans would say, why dwell on negative stuff? You should have as pleasant a life as possible, so don't think about people dying before they do. You'll get to think about that when they do die, Just enjoy yourself for right now. But a Stoic would say, well, this will help me handle things better when they actually do pass away. Or not them, but somebody else.
Right.
Yeah. Let's talk about some of the other emotions that we mentioned a little bit. So, doesn't care for others make us vulnerable to things that aren't in our control? Doesn't that disadvantage us in a certain way?
But don't you also gain advantages from, having those relationships? This is the things that you have to give and take. It kind of reminds me of the end of the Return of the Jedi.
Okay.
Luke is in the throne room of the Emperor, and the Emperor is saying, your friends are your downfall, and Luke is retorting, like, no, like, my friends are the reason that I'm able to move through and eventually surmount this obstacle.
Yeah. It's been a long time since I've seen the movie, but doesn't the Emperor also, like, when he sees that Luke is beaten his father, Darth Vader, doesn't he say, okay, that's fine. Now you can become my new apprentice.
Right.
Take your dad's place. He's dead to me,
Yeah.
Something like that.
And it shows you how, I guess, little they cared for those relationships. They were just tools and not something to actually cultivate and care for.
Yeah, that's a great point. We often talk about this as treating people instrumentally or as a mere means to something else. You can't really love somebody or respect them or care for them as a person if there isn't at least some treating them as if they mattered.
Right. That's you're bringing in a little Kant there, that one should always treat someone as an ends and never merely as a means.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a great way that he articulated it. I think this is a total digression. There's a lot of things where I like reading Kant, but I'm like, well, I don't think this is true at all. I think he got that one right.
Yeah. So
go ahead.
Please.
I was going to say another thing that we want to talk about is our attachments to our friends and families. And other people that we care about. It might be people at work. It might be clients. It might be other people. And we can take this attachment that we do in fact have and experience, some of us more, some of us less, and extend it to all sorts of other people who we might end up being connected with or being involved with or caring for. And I think Stoicism would tell us we have to be realistic about these. And we're going to talk about a practice that ties in with this. Human beings are vulnerable to all sorts of damage, whether psychological or physical. They're not going to last forever. We're all living off of warranty, you could say, right? We're all on borrowed time. And most people are not going to be Stoics, even if we are. So we can't expect them to have the same sort of resiliency if we're practicing it that we could have. And we also have a whole, as you mentioned earlier, we have a whole set of whatever we want to call them, duties, appropriate actions. Those are the Stoic terms for this. We might think of them as moral responsibilities. Some of these are more stringent or strict or or they have a higher priority than others. But, when we pass somebody on the street, they're not nothing. And if we can help them out, the Stoics would say we ought to do that. And this can be furthered by having the right kind of feelings, or trying to cultivate the right kind of feelings, maybe faking the funk until we can actually feel it.
So this comes to like the basis of the idea of justice for Stoicism. And so justice is this large category of things. It's not just like, what happens in the courthouse, but it is also all those things that one ought to interact with other people for. I ought not to call you bad names, partly because you're another human, so I shouldn't be doing that in the first place. Also, especially because you're my friend, and friends don't tend to do that to each other.
Yeah.
And so we have like levels of obligations that we have based on our roles to other people. And so like I would have different obligations to my significant other than I have to you. And I have different obligations that I have to my parents than I have to my significant other.
Yeah. We should mention, too, that justice is a virtue for the Stoics. So this is a character trait that it's not optional. It's something that we ought to have. And so, again, to go back to our original theme of Stoicism doesn't mean withdrawing from everybody else. This is part of what it means to be a social being. You connect with all these other people and you try to do right by them and by yourself. There's another side to justice, and I just want to hit on this quick because I do want to get us to this practice that we'll discuss. Mm-hmm. The Stoics didn't just mean like not violating people's rights or honoring your agreements or following the rules by justice. They are super clear that justice includes kindness and beneficence and whatever else you want to call it, being good to other people. That's a part of justice for them.
Right.
So go ahead.
It's just and right for us to go to his practice here at the moment.
Good segue. So Epictetus tells us, and we won't read the whole thing, but in Enchiridion, or the handbook number 3, in everything that pleases the soul or supplies a want or is loved, remember to add this to the notion. What is the nature of each thing? If you love an earthen vessel, say it's an earthen vessel, because that when it's broken, you're not going to be disturbed. If you're kissing a child or a wife, say that it's a human being who you're kissing, for when the wife or child dies, you will not be disturbed. Now that sounds rather cold, doesn't it?
Right.
How can we use this in a way that isn't being cold and withdrawing from other people? I mean, Epictetus says, if you do love people, and so he's assuming that you are being loving towards them. We don't have to demand of the world things that it can't give, like my wife living forever. I mean, I'd love if she could, provided I could too. But even if I couldn't, I'd still wish that for her. But the world isn't going to give us that. Right. Now,
to love and also be aware of the limitations of us as finite beings. That's
a good way to put it, yeah.
Yeah, that we will lose people and we will have to live on. And how does one continue to do the things that are required of us, even when we lose those that we love?
So we were joking before we got on that my cat, who's almost 19 years old, is doing quite well. And we were talking about this practice. And Dan said, you should whisper into her ear every time that you hold her, you are a cat and you are mortal, you will die. Now, that's, a little over the top, but we could do something like that, couldn't we? Remind ourselves. In some ways, we have more when we do that. We honor the relationship.
We also work better for it because we know that this is a finite thing. This won't always be, and so the time is now.
Yeah. Well, that's a good place to leave off with these reflections. Do you want to lead us out on a pithy quote?
Yeah, so today we leave you with the words of Aristotle. At his best, man is the noblest of all animals. Separated from law and justice, he is the worst.